Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Central Asia, dear Michael, thank you for your kind words of introduction. So let me first thank the three institutions involved and my publisher IB Tauris, who have facilitated this evening's event. Tonight's lecture and book launch marks, as Michael Ryder was just saying, the final conclusion of my history of Central Asia in 4 volumes, which appeared in a biannual rhythm since 2012. However, I won't run you through the whole content of Volume 4, but will concentrate on the question of political and economic independence of the Central Asian states and the painful, indeed very painful, road thither. This means that we will briefly telescope back into the period when Central Asian states lost their independence. So, in the first third of my talk, I will explain the loss of independence of Central Asian states as far they were existing. In the second third, I will talk about the struggle and the achievement of independence and have a brief look at the today's independent states of Central Asia. And then I will conclude the last third with giving an overview about the main issues which concern the present states. In geographical terms, I have to get used to this device. Sorry, now it works. In geographical terms, we define Central Asia as encompassing the 5 so-called Stan states, being Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, plus Mongolia in the northeast and Afghanistan in the south. The age of Central Asian states enjoying a dominant role within Asia and having strong repercussions also on the history of the Middle East and even on Europe, I'm thinking time of the Mongols, ended with Timur Lenk aka Tamerlane. After Tamerlane's death in 1405, his empire began to fragment into various khanates and emirates, such as the Khwarezmian and Uzbek khanates. To their northeast, the 3 Kazakh khanates emerged, and in the 17th century, the Dzungar Empire appeared as the most powerful and last great steppe empire on the continent. In the late 16th century, we see other players entering the scene of Central Asia. First, Tsarist Russia started to encroach on Central Asian principalities. This eastward push was driven by 2 factors. You see here the arrows how slowly or rather rapidly Russian hunters and then followed by Cossacks would go through Central Asia, first from west to east and later from the north towards the southeast. Marked in the red here are always the years the respective forts of Cossacks were founded. This push was driven by 2 factors. Number 1, the quest for resources such as furs, iron and gold. Private hunters and official prospectors would spearhead the advance, and Cossacks in the Tsar's service would follow. The search for a direct trading route with China was the second factor, and this in order to compete with the growing maritime trade routes. In fact, one of the pioneers of the search of a trading route from Moscow Principality to China was an English subject, This was Anthony Jenkinson, who in the year 1558-59 traveled on the order of the Muscovy Company and of Tsar Ivan Grozny, so-called Ivan the Terrible, on a road going from Moscow then to Bukhara. Where do we have Bukhara? Tashkent here. Bukhara, to see if a land route via the former Central Asian states was feasible. Jenkinson was very disappointed of two reasons. He saw that the land route was unsecure due to banditry and continuous war within the Uzbek Emirates and Khanates, and secondly, the market in Bukhara, the former glory, the market was extremely poor and nothing worthwhile to purchase. So this means the Russian would then concentrate first in the 17th and 18th century, trying to go via Siberia into China. In order to avoid armed clashes, the two emerging superpowers, Russia and China, divided in 1689 in the Treaty of Nerchinsk, Eastern Central Asia into respective zones of influence. So, for the first time, formerly independent Central Asia states got divided into zones of influence without them, of course, being consulted. With that agreement, China managed to neutralize Russia, and 5 years later, in the year 1691, Qing China, so ruled by Manchu emperors, managed to force the Khalkha Mongols in the Dolo-No oath into definite submission. A major part of today's Republic of Mongolia became a Chinese protectorate. Subsequently, Manchu-ruled China crushed and annihilated within its zone of influence in the 750s the Dzungar Steppe Empire. You see a very large empire which encompassed quite a significant part of former Mongol Empire, and also to destroy the nation. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Anglo-Russian competition for political dominance and new sales market for industrial products would begin. England had prevented French pan-European dominance at the price of hegemonial aspirations of Russia, ranging from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. This asymmetrical contest between the strongest naval power and the largest land power of those days, the so-called Great Game, was nicknamed Tournament of Shadow by Count Nesselrode, then Russian foreign minister and architect of the long-term Russian foreign policy of the 19th century. Already Napoleon's envoy to Persia, Antoine Romieux, had advised the emperor that Russia's strategic goal was not Persia, was not the Caucasus, but the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. That is, a year-round access to the oceans and the means to put England or Great Britain under pressure via entering with warships into the Mediterranean. Since England wouldn't tolerate a Russian access to the Mediterranean, as was expressed by then Prime Minister the Duke of Wellington, you see here the quote, "The maritime independence of the Porte," so the Ottoman Empire, and particularly the independent exercise of sovereign authority in its own waters, is important to all powers of the Mediterranean and, of course, above all, of Great Britain. Russia's strategy was put strong pressure on British India in order to capture Constantinople in a favorable moment. This strategy was openly declared by Russian military ministers and commanders like War Minister Milutin, I will quote him a bit later, or General Skobelev. You see the quote here, the conqueror of Merv in 1884-85, and was also recognized by various English leaders such as Lord Curzon, the later Viceroy of India. Already in 1818, an advisor to the Russian Foreign Minister, George Winsky, had declared to the Tsar, I quote, Khiva, so the Khanate of Khiva, could become Russia's Gibraltar. This means a bridgehead towards India to put British India under pressure, to shift troops from the United Kingdom towards India and give a chance for Russia to capture Constantinople. In this global chess game, England decided to defend Constantinople and the buffer state Afghanistan, which we will talk quite a bit, while leaving the southern Caucasus and Persia to Russia. In 1838, Lord Auckland, Governor-General of India, successfully thwarted a joint Perso-Russian attack on Herat, we see here, with gunboat diplomacy. But Lord Auckland turned his zero-loss victory into bloody defeat by invading Afghanistan, culminating in the utter annihilation of British Indian troops in January 1842. For the second time within only 3 years, a Central Asian emirate had repelled an attack by a European superpower. But while the Russian attack on Khiva, located to the east of the Caspian Sea, in winter 1839 and 40 had mainly failed due to poor preparation and heavy snowfall, the Afghans won, I have unfortunately to say, the Afghans won because of incompetent English leadership in Kabul and antiquated battle tactics stemming from the Napoleonic Wars. However, I have to mention already previously an attempt by Tsar Peter the Great to launch a military expedition against, again, the Khanate of Khiva in 1717 had miserably failed. The lesson would have been easy to learn. Based on Afghanistan's specific geography, social structures and ethical code, it is easy for strong powers to occupy Kabul, but quite impossible to control the whole country long term. Yet the great game over Afghanistan continued unabated. Although Russia suffered at the Berlin Conference in summer 1878, a humiliating diplomatic defeat when it was denied by the British Navy appearing in the Dardanelles, when it was denied the fruits of its victories over the Ottomans, Prime Minister Disraeli and his unbalanced tool, Viceroy Lytton, provoked the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Kabul was again occupied, whereupon the British envoy and resident Sir Cavagnari, which we see here in a quite self-assured post, got murdered and Kabul conquered for a third time. Next to Cavagnari, the short time reigning Amir of Afghanistan, Yaqub Khan. However, the previously independent country Afghanistan was now, after the Second War, turned into a British protectorate without its own foreign policy, which also meant that the Russian southward attack would have to be countered not anymore at the Indus, as previously, but at the Hindu Kush, or even worse, at the Oxus. The empire risked to be overstretched. At the end of the, by the way, I talked a bit about the Khanate of Khiva, which we see here southeast of the Aral Sea. Here was the second elder political entity, the Emirate or the Khanate of Bukhara. Bukhara, an entity that became only strong in the 18th century, Kokand, and then finally the almost city-state of Merv and the free roaming Turkmen tribes. After the end of the Crimean War in the mid-50s and victory in the northern Caucasus, Russia resumed its pressure on India. In July 1863, War Minister Milutin, I just mentioned briefly before, wrote to Tsar Alexander, I quote, "In case of a European war," so you see, the Crimean War has just finished, Russia got defeated, but they already think of the next war, because their objective, Constantinople, is still on the day's order. So, in case of a European war, we ought to value the occupation of that region, which would bring us to the northern border of India. By ruling Kokand, in today's Uzbekistan, we can threaten England's East Asian possessions. Now, so far, these emirates had been able to maintain quite a large degree of independence, although they were rather poor political entities, since most of the trade was now maritime. Anyway, within 20 years, the situation changed, because within 20 years, Russia advanced under General von Kaufmann, we see here, its southern border on a length of 1,800 kilometers by circa 600 kilometers southwards, crossed the Oxus, and thus abolished the independence of Central Asian Khanates. For example, Bukhara and Khiva remained protectorates with an independent interior policy, while Khokhand, we see here, and Merv, we see there, were simply annexed. There was no independent Central Asian state left on the map, and Russia acquired a close market for its low-quality industrial products. So within about 20 years, the Russian border advanced from here, like this. Russia continued to challenge Britain's naval supremacy at its Achilles heel, the Hindu Kush, and provoked in 1885 the famous Punch Day incident with a mock attack on Herat. Lacking land troops in the region, London was forced to respond with the threat of war, which we see in the quote of the then British ambassador to the Tsar. Based on the British obligations, toward Afghanistan, Afghan Emir Abdur Rahman could have requested a British counter-attack north of Herat towards Sarakhs in order to expel the Russian from occupied Afghan territory. But he desisted, not wishing an Anglo-Russian war taking place on Afghan soil. For a moment, Great Britain had been degraded to be a pawn of the Afghan emir. Finally, in 1895, Russia and England decided to end this conflictual stalemate by demarcating the northern-eastern borders of Afghanistan. There were three objectives. 1. Remove any no man's land around. 2. Establish clear and defensible borders along natural lines. This was done by defining the river Oxus and its feeders Panj and Pamir rivers as borderlines in the northeast of Afghanistan. Third objective, create a demilitarized zone separating Russia from British India. This was achieved by assigning the narrow Wakhan corridor to Afghanistan. So British India and the Tsarist Empire were separated by Afghan territory, which was, however, totally demilitarized. And these are still the today's existing borders between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and then today's Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. The agreement was a diplomatic victory for Afghanistan and England. Since it stopped, we see here the narrow valley of Wakhan, about 280 kilometers long. It stopped the Russian advance southward, and at the same time it represented an acknowledgement by Russia of its military limitation. Nevertheless, the great game now shifted to Persia, Kashgaria, and in the mind of a few politicians, like, for example, Viceroy Curzon, to Tibet, which led to the pointless British invasion on semi-autonomous Tibet in 1903-04. 12 years after the 1895 Anglo-Russian border demarcation in northern Afghanistan, the world had changed. Germany arming was rapidly accelerating. Russia got challenged by the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 and suffered humiliating defeats by the uprising Asian power Japan in 1904-05, while bloody riots erupted in St. Petersburg. And England suffered unexpected setbacks in both Boer Wars. Clearly, both superpowers of the 19th century had become overstretched. In 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention tried to save the status quo. Russia would stay out of Afghanistan. Both powers recognized China's suzerainty over Tibet, which in fact had become more or less de facto independent, so was pushed back into the suzerainty of China. And Persia got divided into zones on influence. In the north, the Russian zone, towards Baluchistan, the smaller British zone, and in the middle, the so-called neutral zone, which during World War I, German agents would be very fast to get into. So the convention divided the Eurasian continent into the two leading powers, England and Russia, and the two satellite empires, Ottoman Turkey, which would have disappeared from the map without Great Britain and China. It looked as if Central Asia was just a cake that could be chopped up by foreign imperial powers. World War I annihilated this world order. While Britain kept its hold over India, Russia couldn't reap the fruits, and here is of course the irony of history, from the secret 1915 Constantinople agreement between Russia and England and France, that in the event of final victory of the Triple Entente, the Bosporus and Dardanelles would come to Russia. Tsar Peter the Great and Count Nesselrode's vision would finally have become true. During the first 3 war years, Tsarist Russia and Britain were allies, also in Persia, as we see here, Brigadier General Percy Sykes and a Cossack commander parading together, and they were fighting together, reinforced by Persian irregulars, to contain the German infiltration into not only into the neutral zone I showed before, but also towards Afghanistan, and sabotage efforts. But after Bolshevik Russia made peace with Germany in March 1980, Britain was involved in local undeclared skirmishes against Bolshevik Russia, for example in Murmansk, in the Caucasus, in Siberia, and also in Central Asia, namely in today's Turkmenistan, where the Melessen mission, we see here General Wilfried Melessen, supported the Turkmen Mensheviks against the Bolsheviks in the so-called War of Armored Train. Just in bracket, about 90% of the Bolshevik armies fighting in this war of armored trains in today Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan were former Austrian and German prisoners of war, basically mercenaries. In 1919, Afghanistan was the first Central Asian country to benefit from the exhaustion of the World War victors. Although it lost the Third Anglo-Afghan War, it won the peace and gained its independence from war-tired Britain. Afghanistan had again proven to be a tough and indomitable cookie. In this photograph, very seldom photograph, we see 4 different Afghan rulers, Kings Habibullah, Amanullah, Inayatullah and Nadir Shah. Afghanistan was in fact till 1973 a monarchy which functions and the complicated balance of power between the king, the members of the ruling family, the mullahs and the tribal leaders. The other Central Asians fared less well. Mongolia gained de facto autonomy from China, only to fall into the Soviet orbit, although it never was a formal part of the Soviet Union, and none of the provisional governments in Russian Turkestan, so today's Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan and so on, none of all these provisional governments could fend off the Soviet power claims. Obviously, Lenin's proclaimed right of nation to political independence was only valid for non-Russian entities, such for example the British colonies. But in Central Asia, the Bolsheviks claimed to be the legitimate heirs to the Tsars. 1978 marked for Central Asia a real watershed. The communist putsch of 1978 and the Soviet invasion 1 year later restarted the great game in Afghanistan, a proxy war between the Soviet Union, which aspired to an access to the Indian Ocean that would threaten the Western world's access to the oil-producing Persian Gulf, and on the other side stood the heterogeneous alliance of Western powers, conservative Gulf states, radical Mujahideen, and Pakistan, which is hidden regional imperialistic vision. It all looked like a repetition of 1839 and 1879 events, superpowers entering the Afghan quagmire without proper exit strategies. 40 years later, we see that one, the Soviet Union, fully collapsed after its defeat, and that the other, the US, has not yet managed to extricate itself from the Afghan trap without endangering the survival of the Afghan government. However, as we will see in a minute, as key result of this war, the Central Asian nations would gain their sovereignty. Yet the Afghan Mujahideen had no common national strategy and remained tools of their mutually antagonistic sponsors. There existed dozens of resistant groups. The 7 main of them were all Sunnis, were recognized by Pakistan and supplied with US and Saudi financed weapons and cash to buy fighters. It is a paradox that while Afghanistan indirectly facilitated the independence of the Central Asian nations, it lost as of 1989 the peace, mainly due to the continued interference from major resistance sponsors, above all Pakistan. As proudly told you see the quote on top right, as proudly taught by former Pakistan Prime Minister Shaukat Aziz to the present speaker 2 years ago. He said, "We, Pakistan, created the Taliban." Pakistan still followed the goal of transforming Afghanistan into a kind of satellite state, providing strategic depth against India. I may also name the main godfathers of the Taliban. They are Brigadier Sultan Terror, Colonel Faizan, Nasrullah Babar, and a few more. Today's situation remains fragile, with the government's control not exceeding 60% of the country's population and remaining dependent on foreign military instructors, troops, private military contractors, and financial support. The main obstacles to peace remain power struggle within the government, dissensions among the Taliban, disruptive factors like the Islamic State Khorasan province. Above all, the key to peace remains with the Pakistani army and its secret service, ISI, and it seems that only China and the US could in a combined together effort exercise enough pressure on Pakistan to end its interference and let the Afghans sort their problems out themselves, regardless what the outcome would be. While the Afghans hardly benefited from the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, the Central Asian nations did. The first one to do so was in summer 1990, Mongolia, which had never been a formal part of the Soviet Union. It gained political independence, but lost the strong financial and economic Soviet support, whereby it became a tributary of international creditors like IMF, World Bank, USAID, and so on. These creditors imposed a market-based shock therapy upon the Mongol economy, such as rushed privatizations, release of consumer prices, and disinvestment of social and educational services. The consequences were soaring inflation, industrial decline, rural exodus, and the fall of many Mongols into poverty. In a certain sense, the international creditors became a shadow government inside the elected Mongol government. The economic turndown was reversed by the accelerated sale of natural resources like copper, coal, and gold. The downside is that Mongolia became dependent on world market prices and exports to China, which by 2015 amounted 88% of total exports. Let's move to another country. Kazakhstan moved very cautiously towards independence in deference to Russia due to the almost 7,000 kilometer long common border, Russia's dominance in the army's offensive course, the huge Russian and Ukrainian community, the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and the immense nuclear arsenal. Just to give you a flavor, in Kazakhstan were stationed 104 intercontinental ballistic missiles codenamed by NATO SS-18, 40 long-range Tupolev 95 bombers, and 650 tactical nuclear weapons. Thanks to Russian, US, and Kazakh cooperation, suddenly the USA became interested in Kazakhstan for the first of two times. Kazakhstan was very fast denuclearized. At the same time, President Nazarbayev moved the country's center of gravity from peripheral Almaty to the new capital, more central capital of Astana. Kazakhstan economy is mainly based on its rich oil and gas resources. A major initial handicap was the fact that all Soviet-built pipelines were directed towards the Russian industrial center, which gave Moscow not only a very lucrative transit monopoly, but also a very powerful lever. For to close a transit oil or gas pipeline down has an immediate financial effect on the exporter and the buyer, much faster and cheaper and with less risk than any military option. Finally, in 2006, Kazakhstan broke Russia's monopoly with an oil pipeline to China, followed 3 years later by a gas pipeline. I will show later a map of the pipeline system in Central Asia. Kazakhstan began also rather early to diversify into agribusiness such as grain, then into finance, logistics and other services. The Kazakh government understood that, to quote former Saudi oil minister Sheikh Yamani, I quote, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stones, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil." A quotation from 1999. Kazakhstan is a relatively well-off country with a per capita GDP of over $10,000 by 2015, and we move now to a poor country, Kyrgyzstan, where the per capita income is $1,100. Kyrgyzstan is by contrast not only poor, but also has in its southwestern territory a very complex geography with rugged valleys and several exclaves and enclaves with neighboring Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. When Stalin had drawn the borders of Central Asia in the 1920s, they were rather unimportant, but suddenly now they had become state borders. These enclaves and exclaves belonging to Kyrgyzstan offer Uzbek and Tajik armed Islamist opposition groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir and the Islamic movement for Uzbekistan sanctuaries where Uzbek or Tajik troops cannot intervene without violating territorial rights, while Kyrgyz forces are too weak to expel this unwelcome guest. Another Kyrgyz issue are the ethnic tensions in the southwest between the rather poor Kyrgyz majority and the better-off minority of Uzbek trader communities, which exploded into ugly riots in summer 2010. On the positive side, Kyrgyzstan enjoys a rather well-functioning democracy, which, of course, unfortunately, couldn't prevent in the past high level of corruption. Just thinking about the way the former presidents Akayev or Bakiev enriched themselves by buying from Russia very cheap fuel for planes and reselling them at a high price to the US during the hot phase of the Afghanistan war. Kyrgyzstan's only natural resources are the Kumtor gold mines, we see at the bottom right, and water. But like its mountainous neighbor Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan's interests as electricity producer are opposed to those of agrarian Uzbekistan and southwestern Kazakhstan. The upstream states want to retain water in summer when electricity needs are low, and use the water in winter when power demands increase sharply. Conversely, agrarian downstream Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan need irrigation water in summer, while water discharged in winter is useless and creates floods. So, either the agricultural states lack in summer water for irrigation, or the mountainous countries lack in winter electricity. In the former Soviet times, a supra-regional power grid regulated the use of water and compensated power shortages. This power grid unfortunately broke down after 1991. Uzbekistan is with 32 million inhabitants the most populous Central Asian state. Its autocratic former President Karimov chose a cautious course of sectorial economic liberalization combined with state control over strategic segments such as cotton, grain, gold, and gas. In face of the Islamist opposition already secretly operating in Uzbekistan since the 1980s due to Afghan infiltration and the return of Uzbek soldiers from the war in Afghanistan since 1979, where they got radicalized, Karimov responded with tough repression while fostering Uzbek nationalism around the figure of Tamerlane. The events of 9/11 dramatically changed the US perspective on Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan mutated overnight from an undemocratic, unwanted state to a frontline state and ally, which happily granted US Air Force facilities. Also, the IMF, which had left Uzbekistan, rushed back to Tashkent. But the US-Uzbek honeymoon was short-lived, and the crisis around Andijan in 2005, which left hundreds of civilians dead, led to the closing of the US airbase. Uzbekistan also got heavily criticized for its system of manual cotton harvesting, using so-called voluntary students, that is, adolescents, an abuse also practiced in Turkmenistan. However, the new President Mirziyoyev in office since September 2016 has started liberalizing the economy and, above all, most promising, improving relations with his Tajik neighbor. Like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan is mountainous, rich in water, and economically poor. It suffers from the additional handicaps of bordering to Afghanistan and of the brutal civil war which took place in the 1990s between neo-communists and the well-armed Islamic opposition enjoying Afghan support. It was defeated thanks to an Uzbek intervention and the persuasive mediation by Russia and Iran, which forced President Rakhmonov and opposition leader Abdullah Nouri, we see here, to conclude peace. Also the fact that Massoud's loss of Kabul to the Taliban in 1996 was forced to leave Kabul was also helpful, since he had to stop supporting the opposition. In the following years, however, Nouri's Islamic Renaissance Party was gradually marginalized and got prohibited in 2015. Still today, Tajikistan remains dependent on Russian cooperation to maintain security and guard the border against Afghan infiltration and to fight drug smuggling. Finally, like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan economy is heavily dependent on the remittances from nationals working in Russia and is thus vulnerable to fluctuations of the Russian economy and currency. It will remain so in the near future, as its main oil and gas field at Boghdar lie close to the Afghan border and at the depths exceeding 6,000 meters. The Sino-French consortium owning drilling rights hasn't really started operations yet. Although Turkmenistan shares borders with Afghanistan, it managed on its policy of permanent neutrality to prevent the Afghan conflicts from spilling into its territory. About 80% of the national territory of Turkmenistan are made up by the Karakum Desert. The country's economy focuses at two sectors: the cultivation of cotton, which is water intensive. Therefore, much water is taken from the Oxus River for irrigation. The same applies to the Uzbek cotton plantations, which contribute to the disappearance of the Aral Sea. We'll come back in a second to that. The second sector is the exploitation of natural gas, whose natural reserves ranks about 4th to 7th worldwide. Like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan was initially caught inside the Russian pipeline network and had to sell its gas at very low prices, even to barter, which gas Moscow resold to Europe at world prices. The second handicap towards Turkmenistan, especially in the early 1990s, was the US policy, which put strongest pressure on Turkmenistan not to do any business with neighboring Iran. Turkmenistan started to free itself in 1996 from the Russian and American tutelage by means of a railway to Iran, followed 1 year later by a first gas pipeline, however of very modest capacity. Further on, other pipelines followed, and these projects were implemented without the US-dominated creditors, IMF and World Banks. Then, in 2009, Turkmenistan gained access to the Central Asia China pipeline, and so can also supply China with gas. Finally, Turkmenistan had become independent. Every visitor of Turkmenistan capital Ashgabat is struck by the spectacular public buildings and opulent presidential palaces. Just 2 examples. We see here in the center the palace of the former President Niyazov, aka Turkmenbashi, and further left the palace of the current president, Berdi Muhamedov. So one wonders, when a third president will follow, will we have a third palace? Finally, let's look now, and I come to the last third of my talk, to some regional key issues. The first is geographical. The gas and oil resources are often located at great immense depths. I was mentioning more than 6,000 meters. Also here, the gas reserve around Atirau in Kazakhstan, 6,000 meters below the sea. And this in a landlocked environment, while world trade today of bulky item is maritime. Especially Kazakhstan, which is very far from Iran and also from the Gulf, especially Kazakhstan is caught in the Russian-Chinese vice. If we look at the pipelines for a second, so green are gas pipelines, dotted lines are planned pipelines, orange is oil. Until 1994-96, all would go towards Russia, all of them. So there was only one client for these countries, that was Russia. And then came first the railway line from Turkmenistan to Iran, one gas line, a second one, and the very important Central Asian China gas pipeline, which we see here, and then finally coming here, going to Kyrgyz, and then further on moving on into China. I may also already mention now the TAPI, that's still a project, however it's under construction, a pipeline leading from Turkmenistan down to Pakistan and ultimately reaching India. I come back to that one. So, pipelines are expensive to build and vulnerable to blackmail by transit countries, as Russia has demonstrated in the past towards Kazakhstan in 1994 and Turkmenistan in 2009. The obvious alternative is via Iran. However, this is blocked since 30 years by the US pressure other alternatives of transport had to be found. Such as an alternative is TAPI, I just mentioned before, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline, transporting Turkmen gas via Afghanistan to Pakistan and India. Here on this map, the green dotted line, and you see such a pipeline could also ultimately, if the US would ever change their position, what is very unlikely, could be linked with a pipeline coming from Iran, and possibly also with a transport corridor from Xinjiang, China, reaching Karachi and the seaport of Gwadar. The project of TAPI started in 1995, and here it becomes again a bit ironic, with the strong support of the Clinton administration. And in 1997, an agreement had been reached and signed with the Taliban and the US-led company Unocal. But the attacks on the US embassies of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam shortly afterwards stopped the project, which was slowly resumed in 2009. The construction of TAPI started in Turkmenistan in 2015, in Afghanistan this very year. The Taliban have apparently promised not to torpedo the pipeline, but their price tag is unknown. Ultimately, as I said, TAPI could be combined with additional pipelines arriving from Iran and China. The second issue concerns water and power management. We already talked about. The interest of mountain upstream and agrarian downstream countries are diametrically opposed. The several bilateral agreements have so far proved to be insufficient, and the kind of renewed interregional power grid is necessary, whereby water storing and hydroelectric producing countries save their water for summer irrigation in the water consuming agricultural states, but are guaranteed electricity and gas supply at strongly reduced cost in winter. The third issue concerns ecology. A consequence of the water-intensive cotton monoculture, which was pushed by Russian Tsarist and the Soviet regimes, and which is still in place today in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and to a smaller degree in Kazakhstan, was the drying up of the Aral Sea. This happened because water needed for irrigation was taken from the two main feeders of the Aral, the Siadarya and the Amudarya. Poor maintenance of the open water channels and the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers aggravated the situation. As a result, the Aral lost since 1960 80% of its surface and 90% of its volume, and the once huge lake separated into several different bodies of water. While the Uzbek part of the lake here, the Uzbek part of the lake seems to be doomed, hope has returned in the Kazakh sector, where the Kok-Aral dike, we see the Kok-Aral dike here and there, the Kok-Aral dike retains the water of the Sea Darya in the north and prevents it to be lost in the deserts in the south. However, unless the cotton monocultures are reduced, the water channels modernized, and a supra-regional water management is implemented, the Aral Sea will not resurrect. Another major ecological Soviet legacy is the nuclear test site of Semipalatinsk, located in the Kazakh steppes, where between 49 and 89 some 496 atmospheric and subterranean nuclear tests were conducted. About 18,000 square kilometers are contaminated, about half the size of Switzerland. I come to the next issue, interregional logistics. We come again to Stalin's border. With the fragmentation of the Soviet Union, the rather unimportant provisional borders from the 1920s became overnight state frontiers, and highways and railway lines became bisected by border posts. Road traffic is hampered by border guards, transit formalities, fees, lack of terminals, and corrupt officials. All this reduces effectivity of transport, increases cost, and diminishes the appeal of road transport through the region. The cost of doing business in most Central Asian states is simply too high. Furthermore, climate warming in the Arctic will open up the northeast maritime passage, which is 40% faster than the one through the Canal of Suez, and is also free of African and Southeast Asian pirates. The Northeast Passage could become in summer a serious competitor to any land route through Central Asia. These last three issues call for improved regional cooperation, which was in the past often hampered by conflicting national interest and also by personal animosities at presidential level. Political Islam is the next issue faced by Central Asia, which was especially the countries bordering Afghanistan, which was especially virulent in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. In Uzbekistan, the two main groups of Hizb ut-Tahrir and the Islamic Movement for Uzbekistan, IMU, have led a bloody guerrilla fight against the Karimov regime, which responded by strict repression. Probably, or even most likely, both Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, however, recently benefited from the rise of the Islamic states in the Middle East, with hundreds of Central Asian fighters, jihadists, moving to Iraq and Syria. As the professor for political science Alexei Malashenko says, democratic pluralism cannot always be the answer to the dilemma of authoritarian regimes, certainly not at once, since free elections may lead to Islamic groupings gaining power, who will then in a second step dismantle these democratic institutions they used to win. On the other hand, in a political landscape without any secular opposition parties, extreme political Islamic or other positions can emerge as the only alternative to the ruling authority. Another issue are good governance and human rights, which secure people's loyalty and, among else, also facilitate foreign investments. I will just quote one negative example in terms of governance, and it concerns the eldest daughter of former President Karimov, Gulnara Karimova. An international investigation began in 2013, and subsequently $800 million were seized by Swiss authorities and blocked. Allegedly, Uzbek prosecutors are trying to repatriate to Uzbekistan 1.5 billion stemming from bribes and kickbacks connected to mobile phone license businesses. Relations with regional superpowers, Russia and China, represent the next major challenge for Central Asian states. In Central Asia, as we saw, the US played only a sporadic leading role, first during the denuclearization of Kazakhstan, secondly in the hot phase of the Afghan war, and third, selectively, the US interfered just to enforce their anti-Iran policy. While China and Russia are rivals in many respects, they share also several common interests, above all in stability in the region. China is afraid of Islamist or otherwise disruptive overspill into Xinjiang, and Russia into the northern Caucasus. And both powers loathe US military presence in their backyards. There are also divergent interests. China is eager to secure power resources from Central Asia for consumption, while Russia wants transit revenues on Central Asian gas and oil exports. So far, the multi-vector seesaw policy of the Stan states worked rather well. To paraphrase a well-known saying, happiness has many pipelines. I am coming towards the end. One of the main, or probably the main, institution enabling the Central Asian states to promote their interest in the face of the two superpowers are the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. It emerged in 2001 from the Shanghai Five, encompassing Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, whose key objective had been to solve the numerous border issues, some of them dating back to the 19th century, objective which was successfully achieved. The SCO now consists of 8 members, 4 observer states, plus dialogue partners and guests, and covers almost half of the human population. It affirms a multipolar world and rejects any unilateralism. The main objectives are security as well as military cooperation, economic and social development. Finally, and I come to the last issue, probably the most challenging, the Central Asian states, I may add maybe also Europe, have to find their place in a globalized continent as outlined by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. The planned land-based corridor, here the orange line, offers the Central Asian states huge opportunities since it is not designed along purely economic criteria. It doesn't lead via Kazakhstan and Russia, which would be a northern route going here, avoiding mountains. It doesn't lead via Kazakhstan and Russia, which would be the easiest and fastest way, but avoids Russia and touches all five Stan states before entering Iran. The land belt has the potential to boost Central Asian economic growth, especially if industrial plants will be constructed along its course and new logistical services will be offered. The project could and also should give a strong boost towards a better interregional cooperation. There remain several open questions. Will the Central Asian states be able to avoid the debt traps of oversight infrastructure projects whose credits they won't be able to repay? The case of Sri Lanka having to yield the port of Harbour Tor for a 1990 years lease to a state-owned Chinese company is a warning sign. Already Malaysia, Burma, Bangladesh have put oversized projects linked to Belt and Road on hold. Especially Kazakhstan will have to continue following a cautious seesaw policy, taking Russian concerns into consideration. It cannot risk giving Moscow a pretext to be forced to protect its nationals living in Kazakhstan. The Central Asian country could also lose in relevance. In view of Beijing's long-term priorities, the Central Asian states might be reduced to a secondary role within Belt and Road, and the newest great game could take place along the maritime road in the Indian Ocean. Also, the bilateral project of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is being successfully, step by step introduced successfully as it improved the power requirements of Pakistan, which ultimately should directly link Xinjiang with Karachi. So Xinjiang here with Karachi, and then also with the Gwadar deep sea port, and thus fully avoid Central Asia as and Afghanistan has the potential to marginalize this region again. Central Asia has to watch to keep somehow in the center of the chess field. Then how will China react if Chinese assets abroad, could also be in Central Asia, are threatened? At the moment, in these weeks, we witness in Sri Lanka the power fight between the Sinophile President Sirisena and the Indophile Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. Could a similar scenario occur in Central Asia, with a Sinophile faction fighting a Russophile faction? Finally, will we witness further build-up of the Chinese armed forces and the start of an interventionist doctrine to protect Chinese interests and assets abroad, possibly also in Central Asia? These are questions which only future history will answer. Before I conclude, let me remind you that refreshments will be now available, and I'm most happy to sign my books offered for sale. Hereby I conclude my brief Central Asian tour d'horizon, and thank you for all your attention.
Christoph, thank you very much indeed. Central Asia is a vast area, and you have given us a vast picture to try to digest. But I know that you have said, notwithstanding the presence of refreshments waiting for us, that you are willing to take a few questions. Given the time, I really must keep it to a few. But can I invite members of the audience to ask Christoph? Yeah, Terence Clark.
Is it not the case that...
Sorry, my hearing is not too good, so I come a bit closer.
Is it not the case that one of the motivations for Russia, Tsarist Russia, to penetrate Central Asia, an attempt to stop the slave trade, the trade in Russian slaves, conducted by the Khanates of Khiva and Samarkand particularly?
Thank you. Of course, Russia had several motivations to enter into Central Asia. I still believe the first one was strategic. That they wanted a tool to put Britain under pressure. And there are many quotes from war ministers and generals that they were aware that in an all-out war, Russia would have to yield to Great Britain. The second motivation was definitely Russia was building up their industrial production in the 19th, but their products were of inferior quality, and they wanted a closed market where European, above all, English competition could not enter. So you buy a closed market. The third one, I believe, that I think in 1864 Russia abolished the serfdom, and suddenly you had millions and millions of former slaves and serfs who were free, but they were not given land. So what should they do? They had to migrate somewhere. And by the 100,000s, then they started to migrate into Kazakhstan. And once they were there, they were in Kazakhstan. There was very fertile regions of the Khanate of Kokand, which was also interesting, and that was the next target. But indeed, you are right. The slave markets of Khiva and Bukhara, above all, was a thorn in the heel of the Russians, because these places, and also by the Turkomans, rapid riders, rider commandos, they would attack Russian settlers, take Russian farmers prisoner, and then resell them on the markets. There were several attempts to free these prisoners. They all failed, and it's quite the irony. Before Russia started then to enter Central Asia, there was a British captain. The name will come when I'm finished. There was a British captain, and he went, or even lieutenant. He went alone to Khiva, which was the biggest market. There were something like 5,000 to 10,000 Russian prisoners and maybe close to 100,000 Persians. And he went to the Khan and managed to place fright and anxiety in his mind. If he didn't free prisoners, the Russian Tsar would come. And then he was able to free, I think, 1,000 or 1,500. It's not Stuart, but something similar. Must have been in the 1840s to free about 1,000 Russian prisoners. But the irony is, by whom did he get celebrated? He gets celebrated by Russian generals, by the British press, and one person was angry. Guess who? The Russian Tsar, because he had no more pretext to attack.
Gentleman at the back there.
Thank you for a very enlightening and insightful talk. In the coming 15 to 20 years, to what extent the fortunes of Central Asian states would depend on the prospects of pipelines, which would either go to China or from north to west via Turkey to Europe, or from east to south via Afghanistan to Pakistan and India. Which of the prospects you see as more achievable?
Pipelines, to what extent is the future? Central Asian states depend on pipelines going to China in the directions.
In the future? No.
In the future.
Okay. First, to give you a picture how the situation is about today. Kazakhstan, as far as I know, exports about 1/3 of its resources to China, and the rest goes into the Russian pipeline network, either to remain there or to be sold further on to Europe. Turkmenistan, I think it was in I'm not sure, 2010 or 2011, Russia stopped to buy Turkmen gas. Then the sales resumed again, but Russia is not a big client of Turkmen gas, which means that Turkmenistan was forced to reduce the price for its gas going to China. It again has the weakness to have just one major client. And for that reason, Turkmenistan is first so interested in barter trade of gas with Iran. So what does it do? It sells Turkmen gas to Iran, which is consumed in Iran, and then Iran sells its gas in the name of Turkmenistan to other countries. Interesting what will happen now that Mr. Trump has revoked the treaty President Obama has done. But this explains also that in the current TAPI project, Turkmenistan is the project leader and also one of the leaders in financial terms. ultimately, of course, if the TAPI project materializes, it's an enormous market. Pakistan urgently needs resources, India needs resources, and for a client state, as soon as then they can diversify their suppliers, they are more than welcome. So in the case of Turkmenistan, the majority of its gas could be sold towards TAPI, if it works.
Thank you. I'm just going to take one more question, I'm afraid, because we are running rather late, and the gentleman at the back there was already...
You mentioned...
Wait.
Wait. I gather that Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan is taking a very different tack than Karimov has in Uzbekistan before. And I wondered, you mentioned it, sort of the change in 2016. I wondered if you could say something about how that's being received and what you think the prospects of it might be. How the change, the liberalising direction that Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan is taking. Yeah. And also, was it Colonel Connolly? Is that Colonel Connolly
Connell.
Yeah.
I think so. No. So that's what we had.
Can you repeat the question, please?
No. So that's what we had in Muhammad. Only the poor guy, he stayed for 2 years in jail. Or the other way around. One of the two got beheaded. They got beheaded after the Brits lost in Afghanistan.
What was that question?
Wait. I have to answer the question.
If you could repeat the question, too.
Yeah.
I think that's...
So the question was, what can be expected for the presidential change in Uzbekistan? Without being too unfriendly to the former president Islam Karimov, I think it could be very beneficial for the whole region, because Karimov and the Tajik president Rakhmonov, they heartedly disliked each other. I could give you several examples where gas and electricity was cut off in winter, and incidentally, I also have a friend in Penji Kent, he's an archaeologist, and he was always complaining that in winter, when they would need gas or electricity from Uzbekistan, Mr. Karimov would cut it to put pressure on Tajikistan. So I think in terms of cooperation between the head of states, an improvement has been achieved. Also, the border between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan has been reopened. There is even direct plane travel between Dushanbe and Tashkent, things that were before totally impossible. Internally, I think there is hope that some liberalization is happening. I think it's of course easier to liberalize the economy, liberalize financial transactions, which is in fact happening. So it's easier to transfer funds. What still has to be seen, how far he will be able, or how willing, the new president will be able to go in terms of political liberalization, but surely the moment, as I said, is not bad, because at the moment the pressure from jihadist fighters is small. So it's the moment he could reduce a bit the pressure on certain groups. So at the moment I would say things look not too bad.
Christoph, thank you very much indeed. This talk has ranged immensely widely. You may find yourselves interested in a couple of events that the Society is organising in the near future. lecture cards are available outside. Please do pick them up. But we are running in January, jointly with the Woodrow Wilson Centre and King's College London, a one-day conference on the Belt and Road Initiative, very much tying in, obviously, to some of the themes that Christoph has been talking about here. And more narrowly, in a couple of weeks' time, David Loyne is going to be talking about why political parties have not emerged in Afghanistan, picking up that thread. Could I invite you, first of all, to show your appreciation to Christoph in the traditional way, and subsequently to enjoy the refreshments outside. Thank you very much.